Okay. Okay, so I am now live, and I am just going to fill the time while I wait to see if anybody else is joining us here. Oh, there's two. Hey, Shania. Shania, is that correct? Thank you for coming. It would be a bit sad for me if nobody did. If you're joining us, if you could put your name, tell me your name so that I can see it. It would be really nice to know that everyone can hear me and see me, and forgive me if I pronounce your names incorrectly. Thank you very much, Teachers Help Teachers. You have a pretty impressive platform there. Juhi, Janice, Tenzia. Okay, now there's lots of people coming. I'm just going to wait until Raki gives me the instruction to actually begin. In the meantime, I'd love you to introduce yourself, and as Raki says, how are you dealing with this very strange educational situation we find ourselves in? It would be good to know how people are coping with that. Thanks, Roshni. I heard once somebody said that with videos, the important thing is the soundtrack. People will put up with a dodgy visual, but not with a bad soundtrack. So it's important that we get that right. Yes. Any particular ideas there of how you're feeling about the current situation? Do you guys know when you're going to be back at school? There was a discussion here today with teachers trying to work out whether the Victorian schools are going to go back at the beginning of next term, which is like a week away. And there's been no definite word yet. They haven't come out to say whether people have to go back or whether they're going online. All a little bit of a bizarre situation here. Priyanka. I had a wonderful student in Singapore called Priyanka. Nice to see you. Now, this is the first time I've done this, so if I'm a bit slow, I'm trying to sort of read and scroll at the same time, and I may not be very good at it, but hopefully it won't be a complete disaster. Yeah, hoping to go back soon. The problem with going back soon is if you go back before they've got a handle on this thing, it could just get worse. But yeah, a very insecure situation to be in. Nobody's really sure of anything. Namaste, Smita. Thank you. Yes, we must definitely applaud educators for adapting. For all the rubbish that teachers get, the fact that they were able to come together so quickly and create so much is astounding. Hopefully people will remember that when we eventually get to go back. So Raki, shall we begin now? Are you quite happy for us to formally start right now? I will take that as a yes. You can't hear me. Avi Ko, you can't hear me. Is there anyone else who can't hear me? Okay, good. Okay, so I am going to begin. Raki's going to be in control of the questions if I don't keep up with them properly, but I will do my best. So first of all, I'd like to say thank you for giving me the chance to share this with you today. It's a little daunting and nervous I am, but delighted anyway. And I was actually born in Kolkata a long time ago. More recently, I was teaching in Mumbai in 2007, and it was during that time that I became really aware of the importance of cultural signifiers in reading comprehension. As an English and literature teacher, this was a significant epiphany. At the same time, we were discovering the potential of the internet to minimize the gap in cultural understandings. And that's mostly what I'm going to be talking about this afternoon. So while the current world health crisis is a terrible thing, and sadly the poor and disadvantaged will, as always, carry the heaviest burden, we've been given the opportunity to share what we know as teachers with our colleagues, not only in our geographical space, but globally. The work you guys have done on the Help Teachers site is significant. There are a lot of teachers there and a lot of really good material to help people understand some of those cultural exchanges. So I hope and trust that you'll continue to upload your materials. One of the things that this situation is definitely going to make us do, whether we like it or not, is become familiar with this video thing. I know lots of people like me don't like it very much, but we do what we have to do. So to begin, I would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which I work, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. And I would like to pay my respect to their elders, past, present, and emerging. So why do I begin this way? Well, it is probably no surprise to you that the British settlement of Australia was both deceitful and violent. Captain Cook proclaimed the country terra nullius, empty country. This completely ignored the many hundreds of indigenous nations that had lived on the land for thousands of years. I doubt that it will also be a surprise that it has only been in the last 25 to 30 years that things have begun to change. Until the 1960s, Indigenous Australians weren't even counted as citizens and did not have the right to vote. It was around the time of the landmark Mabo decision on the 3rd of June 1992 that Australians began to acknowledge that the settlement was not so much a claim to empty land, but an invasion of another's lands. It is now accepted as right and proper that any group or person make an acknowledgement of the country when working or gathering anywhere in Australia. And so, why does this matter in teaching literature? Well, it matters because no matter what text you're reading, be it Patrick White or Jessica Anderson or Morris West, you need to understand that at that time, the time they were writing, Indigenous Australians were completely marginalised, their voices ignored. If they were able to get noticed, their names were usually anglicized, and they were, as a people, diminished. It was not until 1987 and the publication of Sally Morgan's breakthrough novel, My Place, that things began to change. This knowledge changes the way you read the text. It changes your understanding of the voice of the author. I would suggest that this is a situation that Indian writers are very familiar with. And our students need to understand this if they're going to meaningfully interact with the texts that we set. What we also need to know, and what they need to know, is that huge sections of the canon that have been presented as English literature are actually not. For those of you who majored in literature, I'm sure you read by Irish writers, by American writers, by Canadian and Russian and French and Indian writers and many other nationalities, all conveniently but wrongly gathered together in the culturally imperialist designation of English literature. I think it's time we finally remove that final umbrella of colonialism and stop talking about English literature at all, and talk only of world literature. Even the newer term literature in English silences the many rich voices that have been part of our reading experience. It's time that we gave the correct acknowledgement to the culture and beliefs of the nations in which the literature was born. This will go a long way to improving the comprehension levels of our students. Why? Because comprehension is not a skill, it is a function of knowledge. Consider this. A small child playing in the snow builds a snowman. The child has learned the word snow and what it means from the adults around him or her. They know that it's cold and wet and only happens at one time of the year. When they're reading a picture book with a picture of a snowman and they start to sound out the word, the knowledge they already have enables them to work out what the word is. This is how we learn to read. Now, imagine if you grew up in Central Australia or the Middle East or Southern India. You wouldn't have any understanding of the concept of snow or its wider meanings. If you're given the same picture book with a snowman, you would have no way of working out the word. Nothing in your experience or knowledge base would assist you in making meaning with the text. It would be inaccessible. And thus it is with many of the comprehension tasks we give to students. They can't comprehend what they're reading because they don't necessarily have the knowledge they need. An American English teacher who I've been following for a while, Dave Stewart Jr., wrote an excellent piece on this last September. I will admit that I think it's excellent because it agrees with me, but there you go. Anyway, he argues that that understanding, comprehension, is far more a function of domain-specific knowledge than it is about the application of generic, very boring, and confusing skills. And let's be honest, many of us feel exactly the same about those mind-numbingly dull exercises in comprehension that we have had to set and or mark. In place of this, Stewart suggests the following activities when reading. Look up unknown words, dig into cited sources, follow links to read more on topics mentioned in the reading, reread difficult passages, ask questions, summarize, paraphrase, and annotate. All the same activities that we use when reading, particularly those of us who have an insatiable desire to know things. It's certainly true that content knowledge has been devalued in recent years. Dr. Natalie Saris speaks of this at length in her article, The Content Comeback, why knowledge matters to thinking and learning. She acknowledges that there has been a move toward design thinking, creative problem solving, and project-based learning. All well and good. But she argues that we're kidding ourselves if we deny the importance that content knowledge plays in reading and thinking. And that was just a really loud car. Sorry. Cyrus draws unapologetically on the work done by E.D. Hirsch, who argues that writers assume that readers know some things but not others. And that is always the way that new information is offered. It is embedded in a mountain of knowledge that readers are expected to have already in their long-term memories. A student who is unfamiliar with that mountain of knowledge will be lost when encountering a text that presumes that the reader is familiar with it. We know there are problems with the idea of content knowledge. We know that it is true that students from low-income families or knowledge-poor homes are disadvantaged in spaces where this knowledge is required. But surely we can find better ways of bridging the gap than simply throwing the baby out with the bathwater. We also know that setting literary texts that are created in one space will absolutely disadvantage students in another. I've watched in horror as students in hot, vast, barren countries like parts of Australia have been expected to engage with classical English texts. I'm not saying that we should never stretch our students, but surely we must never set them up to fail. To set content knowledge up as an adversary of higher level reasoning skills is disingenuous. The two are obviously interrelated. Cyrus claims that we can't challenge an assumption unless we have evidence that contradicts it. We can't create connection between ideas unless those ideas are already stored in our memory. When an expert encounters a new piece of information in his or her field, they can situate it only in the web of existing knowledge and assess the new content relative to what they already know. When a novice encounters a new piece of information in an unfamiliar field, he or she can only accept it on face value. Any of you who have undertaken higher degrees by research know that the literature review and the demand that you show how your research fits in and improves the field of knowledge is critical. So before we move on, just a minute, I know that I am super way behind. So I'm just going to have a quick thing through. Is mistake we get? Yes, pictures do help understanding content knowledge. Yes. Okay. So I'm going to depend on Raki and her wisdom to make me see when there are things that she wants me to stop and pay attention to. Before we move on to some thoughts on pedagogy, I would really like to open the discussion of Indian literature and the diaspora. Last year, I attended an Austrade webinar on the Indian education market. One of the panelists was a gentleman called Sanjay Radhakrishnan of Tata Class Edge. Their vision of reducing educational inequality matched so completely with ours that I gathered my courage, found an email for him and wrote to him. We're launching a podcast where we get English teachers from different countries to talk about how they would teach a text from their culture. What the cultural understandings are that we in the West don't have. I asked Sanjay for his suggestions of Indian teachers who would agree to be interviewed. And he got back to me very quickly and expressed surprise that we were reading Indian texts. And I was really surprised that he was surprised. The names of Narayan, Rushdie, Lahiri, Seth, Roy, Ghosh and Desai, both of them, are familiar names in literature. Yet Pritam, Haider and Chugtai are not. It was then that I realized that many, not all, but many of the Indian writers that we're familiar with are those who are part of the Diaspora. I would be very interested to hear the thoughts of Indian literature teachers as to what the differences may be, say, between the work of Arundhati Roy and Jhumpa Lahiri. Lahiri's The Namesake certainly includes the diasporic features of alienation, nostalgia, and the amalgamation of cultures. I can relate to this in a way. My parents are Scottish. I was born in India and spent my primary years in Singapore, arriving in Australia when I was about 11. I was 11. Like many, my relatives brought a particularly Scottish culture with them and worked very hard to maintain it. Hard to do in Australian summer, but there you go. And like many, I don't always have a clear understanding of where home might be. I have a friend who's from Kerala, and she doesn't particularly like The Namesake. She thinks Lahiri exaggerates the experiences. I would be really keen to get your thoughts on what is considered by Indian people living in India to be valid Indian literature. If you could put the notes in the comments, and then we'll make sure we can get a hold of them at the end of today, because I'm really interested in this. Okay, so how are we going for time? We're still going well. Are there any, if we could elaborate on developing reading skill? Yeah, the literature review. Ugh. Okay, how do you develop reading skills? Well, to be honest, I think we have to start by going back to the stories that our students actually are familiar with. I think we need to, the thing we want most is to have students who love to read. Because reading, once you start doing it, you realize that you are learning something new every time you read. Every time you read a new text, you end up knowing more than you did at the beginning. And we want students to do that. We want them to read in order to learn things. That means that at the beginning, we've got to make the reading, I'm not saying make it easy, but we can't make it so difficult that they give up because they don't see themselves in the text, they don't understand the context, they're reading a novel or even poetry or any of those things, and there is nothing in them that they can connect to their understanding. I have a friend who did a project with refugees in Australia, and Somalian refugees in particular. And what they did was they went out and recorded their mothers singing their particular songs to the children. And they recorded these, and they built up this body of work in recordings. And then some of them went to a printer who printed out the stories and illustrated them. That is the best way for those children to then learn another language, to be able to, because until you can decode, until you know the language, until you can meet the four, these was code breaker, text analyst, text user, the different the activities that we go through when we read, you need to start teaching those with material that students understand. And then once they've got that, once they can do that, then you can add more and more challenging literature if you need it, or when you need it. You're always going to need it. Come on. So I think developing reading skills is definitely something that requires an understanding. It requires that the students can somehow access the text. They can make meaning from it that means something to them. They can see themselves and their lives in the material that they're learning to read. Now, to do that, you need some really passionate readers. You need readers who are going to inspire the students to want to read more things. You're going to need people around them who value the very task of reading and the ability of literature to illuminate the world for us. And now I'm starting to get carried away here, so I better pull it back a bit. Somebody, oh, okay, thank you. Let me just, is set in India. Yes. Yeah, absolutely. A book. Shreya says the book Broken Flute by Shada Dwivedi is being taught in grade 5, set in India. Absolutely. As many as possible. The books that you, oral traditions, of, yes, but give the students books set in India by Indian writers that they can relate to, and then be passionate about it, get them excited by it. That's how you develop reading skills, I believe. Okay, so yes, please forgive me. Yes, listening comprehension, equally important, supplements reading and caters to auditory learners, absolutely. And I think that was one of the advantages of the scheme I was telling you about before, because they recorded it first. They recorded the mothers telling the stories and then printed and illustrated them. Yes, with you. Good, thank you. I'm glad to see that so many of you agree. Not that I'm surprised, but still glad. So before I move on to some of the pedagogical stuff, is there anything there, Raki, that I have missed? Raki, I possibly have. Okay, so Roy and Lahiri are forefront writers for Indian literature. Okay, that's good. In the middle class, yeah, easier. I mean, I love the namesake. Is just, I discovered it when I was in Abu Dhabi, of all places, and just love her writing. So, the importance of grammar in English. Oh, okay, so grammar is important, no doubt about it. Grammar is important. We know those fun sayings. Let's eat grandma. Now, if you don't put the exclamation part after eat, we end up with a slightly dicey situation for grandma. There are a number of funny ways that we can see the importance of punctuation and other grammatical things. However, I don't think that, I don't know. I obviously learned grammar the old way. I learned grammar as part of learning another language. I was in school in the 60s, so it was still the old way of doing something. It was a very British education. So until we came to Australia, that old grammar way of teaching grammar was the main one, and it is deadly, but it's a hard one. I don't think teaching grammar out of context is particularly helpful, personally. But then again, also, I'm a senior school teacher. I sort of hope that by the time students come to me, they already know basic grammar. It's a tough one, and I would want to defer to some primary teachers, perhaps primary school teachers, about what they think are the best ways of teaching grammar. The way we do it, the way I have done it in my last sort of 15 years or more, was to address it as it occurred. So the students would write their essays, and they would be the standard ones of, I should have gone to the store. No, you shouldn't have done that at all. You should have gone to the store. Pronouncing things incorrectly means you're going to write them incorrectly. And so you're repairing errors as they appear. But I don't know whether that is the best way or not. As I said, I think I'd like to defer to some primary teachers. Grammar is important in any language. If you misuse grammar, it can change the meaning. We know that. But newspaper does help reading, as long as the newspapers don't have so much political and other stuff that your head wants to explode. I am not reading a lot of news at the moment because there's a whole lot of, it just makes me want to cry a lot, so I prefer not to. Learning new vocabulary. A central way of value of reading is finding new words. In the olden days when I was at high school, they used to give us lines. Have you ever, I'm sure some of you remember that thing, you do the wrong thing and you get lines. Well, we had one teacher who used to say you had to write so many lines, but they all had to have 13-letter words in them. They had to, or 12-letter words. So you had to go through the thesaurus and the dictionary looking for words with 12 letters in them, or 13. I actually found that fun, but I'm a bit of a nerd. So, but I learned new words, which you'll be good at any other. That's true. Nagma says, if you're good at one language, you will be good at any other. Thus, the mother tongue becomes important. Absolutely. Absolutely true. I think, anyway. I would like to say that while many of these facts are properly researched, and I have the, citations, it's my opinion. And I may, probably, possibly, could be wrong. Okay, so, oops, there's a green one. Oh, my partner, Judy Heffron, has joined our conversation. She can do that because, yes, she has access to this page. Yeah, let's eat grammar. Jaya, that's one we use a lot. How to increase children's writing skills. Well, first of all, I think, my thought is, and by the way, any questions for grammar could be sent to Judy. She is officially the grammar police. Seriously, no one polices grammar like Judy. Writing, I think writing is just a practice. It's the more they write, the more we write, the better we become at it. But get them to write about things they know, get them to write about things that happen to them. I used to have an exercise I did with my students, and so that everyone had to give a 1-minute oral over the course of a week. And I would tell them that, okay, next week the topic will be your favorite popular music video and why. And they would have 1 minute to present their information. And we had little cards that we could tick to see if, you know, the things that they needed to think about. And I'd get other kids in the class to mark them according to the criteria, so they got to understand that. But then I would ask them to write it out. So they'd already spoken it, and then they had to write it, which meant that they were moving from one coding to another. And the more they do that and the more confident they get at doing that, the better they become, I think. We can address that again, because right now, yes, grammar and writing can be taught through literature. Yes, love these people. All right, so I will move on. Some popular and emerging pedagogy. Now, in starting to talk about pedagogy, I think there are two questions we have to think about. And that is, what is the role of the teacher, and what is it we are tasked to do? There's no doubt, absolutely no doubt, that strong relationships are the foundation of good teaching. Students will not learn from teachers they don't like or respect. But that's often taken to mean that we need to be cool or entertaining. And that's just not true. Students are not customers. If anyone is a customer in the transaction, it's the parents. Students come to teachers to learn. Just as they go to doctors for medical issues, they come to teachers to learn. And it's not up to them to decide what they're going to learn and what they're not going to learn. That's just nuts. The example I often use for this is vegetables, and it's probably not a great example in India. But think about a food we didn't like, that we were forced to eat as children. We don't refuse to give it to our children because we didn't like it. If it's good for them, then we're going to give it to them. We may look at preparing it differently, but we're still going to make them eat it. The reason we make school compulsory is that if we didn't, a lot of kids wouldn't go. And that's fair. We don't go to places that we don't want to go to, so why would they? Right now, and I'm sure a lot of you are enjoying this just as much, right now, parents everywhere are getting a little taste of what teachers have to face every day in the classroom. Students, by nature and definition, are not mature enough or knowledgeable enough to decide what they need to learn. And sometimes the things they need to learn are just not that interesting. And I think we need to be more open about that. I think we can tell them that. I think it was perfectly reasonable, because I did it, to say, look, I know this isn't interesting, but we have to do it. And the quicker we get it done, the quicker we can move on. Nobody always gets to do just what they want. It's not realistic, either in the classroom or in the world. I believe absolutely that you can be a demanding teacher as well as a popular one. Because all it takes to be popular with kids is that they believe you care about them. That no matter what you expect, you're going to be on their side. That's all. That's not a lot. Because if you can't do that, then no matter how smart you are or how good your pedagogy is, the students are not going to come along for the ride. So, now that that's out, a couple of popular movements in teaching English and literature that I would like to touch on. And one that's been around for a while, and it ties in, of course, is the idea of culturally responsive teaching. In some ways, it's a bit sad that we needed this movement, but it does bring some challenges to do it well. Shania, can I get back to you on that? If Raki can just notice that. Tips for improving language and vocab. In 2000, Professor Geneva Gay wrote that culturally responsive teaching connects students' cultural knowledge, prior experiences, and performance styles to academic knowledge and intellectual tools in a way that legitimizes what students already know. So we're back to building on what students already know. But Gay took it further. She posits that we, as teachers, must be aware of the different cultural understandings of our students in order to provide each student with a way to learn successfully. A small example of that, very trivial in the Australian context, is eye contact. As Europeans, we're raised to look at people when they're speaking to us. But this is not the same for some Indigenous groups. For them, it's kind of rude to look someone in the eye, particularly if they're in a more exalted position, be it an elder or a teacher or whatever. To demand that they do that will diminish their sense of self and thus impede their learning. Because if students are not able to feel positive about who they are as learners, they're not going to learn. The great strength of culturally responsive teaching, as far as I can see, as it is absolutely not a thing. Not a thing. There's no magic formula, no one way of doing it, no guaranteed way of success. It's not a plug and play. The only constant is that at some point, we, the teachers, have to face and dissect our own biases. She goes on to say, Gay goes on to say, culturally responsive teachers realize that mastering academic knowledge involves understanding that content maps can provide multiple avenues to understand and access information. What it involves really is accepting that there is no such thing as a standard student, and that standard ways of teaching and testing are bound to marginalize some of the students in your class. And while there may be many possible culturally responsive teaching strategies, there are none that work for every situation. Teachers need to use what will work with the students sitting in front of them, not some idealized student group that we're told to teach to. People need to stop and trust that teachers know the students who are sitting in their class and know how best to reach them. More importantly, as important, culturally responsive teaching is not the same as multicultural teaching or even teaching for justice. In an interview with Zaretta Hammond, author of the 2015 book, Culturally Responsive Teaching and the Brain, American teacher Jennifer Gonzalez came to understand that culturally responsive teaching is not about making your students feel more accepted and comfortable. It's actually about building the learning capacity of the individual student. So there's a focus on leveraging the affective and the cognitive scaffolding that students bring with them to your class. There are some points of contact between culturally responsive teaching and reader response theory that became popular in the 1960s, most famously presented, of course, by Roland Barthes in his essay, The Death of the Author. each puts the reader-learner at the center and builds on what is already there. This can be a challenge in the classroom. It absolutely flies in the face of the idea of a class text, a single book or play, etc., that all students have to do at the same time. When we choose one text, no matter how good, some students will be privileged and some marginalized. Much of the teaching we do in English and literature is around themes and values. So there's no real reason to have just one text. Providing a few options or choices allows students to select texts that maybe more closely meet their prior understanding. It also provides a really good lesson on responsibility. If they choose the text, they can't blame the teacher if they don't like it. My personal favorite thing to do in the world and in literature is alternative readings. Looking at a text and coming up with different ways of seeing it, putting forward alternative interpretations. To do this requires an understanding that the literary canon is a construction. It requires understanding that the canon has evolved in a way that presents the values of the dominant voices in society. Texts do not emerge from the ether in a moment of inspiration, free from cultural, social, and historical influences and assumptions. Texts are deliberate constructions and are composed in a particular cultural, social, and historical context. And the act of reading also takes place in a particular cultural, social, and historical context. In a 2014 article titled Teaching Canonical Literature for Critical Literacy, Carolyn Newall, Michael McCalliso, and Robert Petroni argue that many canonical texts perpetuate ideologies that are also dominant. For much of history, the dominant ideologies have been around such things as whiteness, masculinity, heterosexuality, and Christianity. Bush and Black et al. Argue that some of the modern literary techniques, such as reader response, don't actually question or challenge dominant ideologies. They believe that by employing critical literacy, we get to examine issues of power, normativity, and the way representations in literature perpetuate privilege and marginalization. It is really important that our students are taught to question everything. Whenever they make a statement about the literature, we need to respond with the question, according to whom? When our students are taught to question every assumption, to understand that language and texts are not neutral, that they are almost always ideological, the discussion around the literature becomes far more interesting and rigorous. It is no surprise to anyone who knows me that I lean toward resistant reading practice. And this practice can really stretch students. At its simplest, there are three ways of reading the text: the dominant, the alternative, and the resistant. The dominant reading is the one that is most accepted. We may see the obvious one. An alternative reading is also acceptable, usually supports the same values, is just another way of interpreting the story. The resistant reading, however, refuses to play by the rules. It is skeptical. The resistant reader is searching for where the gaps are. They're looking for what voices are being silenced, and they definitely want to challenge the dominant ones. Fairy tales are an excellent way to illustrate dominant and resistant readings. And I realize I'm running out of time, so I will start to tie this up. Think about Little Red Riding Hood. The dominant reading is that children should obey their parents because disobedience is dangerous. It's dangerous to talk to strangers. Females are vulnerable, but can rely on men to protect them. Males are rescuers. They're stronger than females and better able to protect themselves and others. That's a dominant and widely accepted understanding of Little Red Riding Hood. However, a resistant reading sounds something like this. The female figures fall into three clear stereotypes of what a woman should be. Mother is a carer, Little Red Riding Hood is a dutiful daughter, and Grandma is a helpless victim. The male figures are the wolf, a predator who stalks the female child, and the woodcutter, who is the typical male hero rescuing the damsel. Women are seen as people who should obey instructions. Little Red Riding Hood is implicitly criticized for disobeying her mother when she was simply exercising childish curiosity. Women, especially the young, are seen as prizes who can be won. Sometimes I've put students into three groups, one for each reading practice. Their task is finding evidence in the text to support their reading. It can be a lot of fun. Each of us will have reasons for believing the subject we teach is of value. For teachers of literature, sometimes the value of literature is in teaching values. As we have said, no text is neutral. It will have a range of values, and the value of literature is that we teach students to question the values in the texts and therefore in their lives. We don't ask that they deny their values, we just ask that they be aware of them and know that they can influence us. And there's no doubt that much of our discussion about pedagogy is now going to be around technology, and we don't yet know how that'll work. I doubt there has ever been a time when educators globally have faced the same experiences or experiments, and we're going to learn things in the next few months which will have a huge impact on how we teach. And I think that applying the processes we use in reading will be really helpful. The questions we need to ask for any piece of technology or technological activity are these. Who created the text? What is the intended audience? In other words, who's it produced for? What is the purpose of it? When was it created? Who is empowered by it? And who is marginalized? Perhaps this way we can ensure that any tech we end up with will serve the needs of students and teachers and not the other way around. The English classroom needs to be a place where there is space for multiple narratives, a place where a passionate reader leads students on a voyage of discovery, a voyage that may lead to multiple destinations as long as the ship is steered using evidence from the text. So, the takeaways, the things that I think are important is, let's stop talking about English literature. It is important where the texts come from. Comprehension is not just a skill, it requires knowledge. And no matter what the curriculum, if students are reading literature, writing about literature, talking about literature, and talking about their writing about literature, and if they are questioning all of the above, then they will be just fine. And that's it. Thank you. So I'm going to have to go here. Oh, thank you so much, Shania. So, role play to improve reading skills. Anything that gives students some sort of knowledge that they can then attach meaning to is going to help. You know, teachers need to be more confident. I think as a profession, teachers suffer the most from what's that syndrome I keep forgetting, imposter syndrome. No group of professionals put so much into gaining knowledge, and no group of professionals that I can see undervalue themselves as much as teachers do. Teachers know how to reach students, and sometimes I think curriculums and such just need to get out of the way, but that's all right. I can make a really good teacher. I can make a really bad employee though. So I'm just reading through. Raki, can you, yes, Raki, can you tell me, is there things I've missed? Because there's so many here, and yes, getting them excited is so important. Okay. Oh, thank you. Thanks for coming, guys. That's awesome. Thank you for your valuable knowledge. And thank you guys for your knowledge too. Remember that. This is not somebody teaching you. This is us sharing. Oh, you're all very, very kind. Thank you. Okay. All right. So, Raki, I am in your hands, my friend. Oh, you're all very, very kind. Yes, Raki asks that you fill in the feedback form. That would be good. My student vocabulary and culturally significant instruction styles can create it. Absolutely, Mahara. Yes. People just don't, you know, anyone who thinks these standardized exam things are good is students are not standard. Discussing the, sorry, hang on, characters, the style response of characters would help in, of course, yeah. New pedagogies don't make old pedagogies redundant. Some might, but on the whole, they're not things we use instead of. We use whatever can work. Thank you. Oh gosh, you're so nice. So I don't know what I need to do now. Raki, do I end the live video here? Yes. Value who you are and what you know, because our children need us to do that. The children of the future need you to value what you teach. Okay. Raki, if you can tell me if you want me to end the video. Okay. I think I'll just end the video. Thank you. Okay. Ending video.